Hey y'all, it's Mr. Roseman, and today we're going to be examining the foundations of China, also known as the Middle Kingdom, from approximately 1000 BCE to approximately 600 CE. We're going to examine geography for China and several key conceptual foundations for Chinese society. And last, we will move on to some major points about the Qin and Han dynasties, two dynasties that set many precedents for the long term of Chinese history. Recall that China is one of several different states found in the region of East Asia. So you have China itself, although China of the past was considerably smaller than what it is today, at least in the foundations period. Recall that we also have North Korea today, modern world, and South Korea, Japan. There's several others, but those are the big four East Asian states or nations that we will be examining the path of for this course. But when it comes to China's geography, it's extremely diverse, just as the United States is diverse in its topography, climate. The same is true for China. In much of China, you would find a similar climate in all four seasons that you do here in the United States. But there are also deserts, like the Taklamakan Desert in western China, the Gobi Desert in north central China. You have several different mountain ranges, the largest of which is the Himalayas, which separates the region of South Asia from China itself, China proper. The temperate climate in which China finds itself in the north is, again, very similar to what we have here in North Carolina, whereas the further south you go, you enter into more tropical, subtropical environments as we head towards areas like Vietnam. The riverways of China, even though they look like they're all over the place and seem to run in every direction, most rivers in China that are navigable run east to west. For example, the Huanghe or Yellow River, the Yangtze River of China. So there may be northern and southern turns for those rivers, but they generally run east to west. The eastern coast of China is guided by the Pacific, although as we will see later on, China, by its sea connections, is a participant in the Indian Ocean trade network, even though it does not connect to it directly. But it is accessible by sailors traveling around Southeast Asia here into the Indian Ocean. China is very unique in that even though it did have contact with the outside world, it developed in greater isolation from other major centers of civilization. Therefore, the cultural traditions that China develops is very much set apart from other centers of culture like those of South Asia or the Middle East or the Mediterranean. So we'll see a very different path in many ways that China follows culturally and socially. Let's get on here to some key concepts of foundational China, and we will build on the Chinese geography as we move on through our course. There are a couple key main things that we need to keep in mind as we move forward in our examination of China throughout AP World. For one, the Chinese refer to China as the Middle Kingdom. So think about what that implies about their worldview. The middle idea of this suggests that they are in the center of the world. So they understand that there are people outside of China, but in the Chinese view, it's rather ethnocentric, feeling that the Chinese way of life is superior to all other peoples. So there might be other sophisticated cultures outside of China, but in the Chinese view, they are barbarians. Those outsiders are barbarians. There's very little of good or value that's coming from the outside world, outside of China, or rather this Middle Kingdom. As a result, and because of their considerable isolation, not complete, but considerable isolation from other major areas of the world, they develop a sense of xenophobia. And that's a term that you've probably come across before in your academic studies. But this is a feeling that the outside world, foreigners, they're no good. They're not to be trusted. We should always be suspicious of outsiders and what they mean for China. Now, just about every civilization, even our own, has feelings of ethnocentrism and degrees of xenophobia, but China, during this foundational era into the upcoming periods of our course, we'll be examining that dynamic between the Chinese world and their neighbors and outsiders. So keep that in mind. China, the Middle Kingdom, that's their concept of themselves. That is a reflection of how they view themselves in relation to the rest of the world. Like all civilizations, since the Neolithic, these foundational civilizations have their basis in agriculture. You might have the stereotypical view that the Chinese consume nothing but rice. That is inaccurate, especially here in this early period, foundational period. Grains like wheat and millet, oats, those are developed first and in northern China in the Huanghe River Valley. And in southern China, rice began to be cultivated, and it needs a wet environment, warm environment in order to grow. And yes, rice does become abundant in culture and cuisine throughout China, but there's an array of different grains that are grown by peasant farmers throughout China. I have this labeled under agriculture in part because I didn't really have anywhere else to put it effectively, but China very early on in the foundations period becomes associated with silk production. And you probably are already aware, but in case you're not, silk is not a grain. It's not grown in the sense that it's a plant. Silk comes from silkworms. Silk is produced as cocoons, or silk thread is produced from the cocoons of silkworms that live off of mulberry leaves. Very specific in terms of what these silkworms eat. And the story goes that back in the Shang Dynasty, even before this classical era for China, some women were cooking a stew here in China. Again, this is just the story. Whether this is actually true or not, I'm not certain. But the story is told that these women were boiling this stew underneath an mulberry tree. And one of these cocoons fell into the stew, and they saw what happened, yet they decided they were just going to ignore it and continue to stir their boiling pot of stew. But when it came to time to serve up this stew to their families, they saw that cocoon had unraveled into a single thread of silk. And it wasn't long before or long after that they took this silk thread, and realizing just how durable, strong it was, yet soft, they started weaving with it. And what they came up with was silk cloth, which the Chinese in this era and into the next era had a complete monopoly on the production of this super fine, lightweight, cool to the touch silk. And this becomes a key commodity good for China in terms of export, since they're the only ones who know how to produce it, and even it was by law illegal to, punishable by death, to share the secret of silk with outsiders. Keep in mind that idea of xenophobia in the Middle Kingdom. China makes a bundle of money off of exporting silk cloth, silk textiles to the outside world via, appropriately enough, the silk trade routes or Silk Road, and also the Indian Ocean Trade Network that we'll get to later on. All right. So this will put China in an economic advantage very early on, and that's an economic advantage they're going to hold on to until the very late 1700 CE, 1800 CE. Only about 200 some years ago did that economic powerhouse status end from the time that it begins in this foundations era. We're also going to look here at some key religious ideas, and what popped up there is the yin-yang symbol, which I'm sure you've seen before as well, but we need to put it into context for classical China. Before we do that, some underlying key concepts for China here that we will see continuing on all the way up to the present in China is ancestor worship. Now, what this means is that the Chinese, and I will add, the Chinese are not the only ones who have this belief in ancestor worship and practice of ancestor worship, but there's this underlying belief that when your parents die, your grandparents die, extended family die, they don't really die. I mean, their bodies, their earthly bodies might disappear, but as long as you honor them, remember them, maybe have a shrine in your home, give them offerings of food, light candles, all right, pray before them, those ancestors will never disappear, all right? They will always be here in this world in spirit form, and they're influencers on your life and your family's life. So there's this deep connection with the idea of family. Family is extremely important, and it's in a lot of ways the building block for society in China. So again, China's not the only ones that have their own ideas of ancestor worship, but it is one that we will come back to time and time again through this course. Now, if you neglect your family or your ancestors and remembering them and honoring their name and maintaining family honor, bad things will happen, but they'll also disappear perhaps, and you will get no benefit from their interaction with you on a daily basis. Chinese traditionally have strong feelings of animism. Not animalism, but animism. This is the idea that in the natural world, there are spirits that pervade everything in the natural world, or at least a lot of major things, whether it's trees, grass, mountains, the sun, all right? And this is tied up as well with polytheistic beliefs. So this idea of multiple gods and goddesses, but there's not one religion that defines all Chinese. There is diversity throughout China. Recall, again, seeing that map of China, it's a big place, all right? But these are some underlying religious concepts that we will see ongoing through Chinese history. There's also built or associated with Chinese society this idea of maintaining harmony, all right, or yin-yang. And you see there this symbol that represents this maintenance of harmony, this white and black circle, which represents masculinity and femininity, male, female. For every one thing, there's an opposite thing. They work together. They need to be in balance, all right? And if harmony is not maintained, what happens? Chaos, all right? Things fall apart. Things they go bad. So the search for harmony in all things, that is something else that's going to pervade Chinese outlooks on people's interactions with their environment, with fellow people, with their government. And we'll see how that plays out in the development of Confucianism and Taoism, especially as two key philosophies that develop in this foundational classical period. There are several also political characteristics that we need to associate with China. starting here with the classical foundational period. For one, starting with the Qin dynasty, it's spelled Qin but pronounced Qin, we see strong political centralization. We will talk more on that in a moment, but once we see that happen with the Qin, we're going to see pretty much all subsequent dynasties developing a centralized government. So think ruled by one person in this case with tight political control over their state, this middle kingdom. All right, no loosey-goosey, limited power split up. We don't see that in China, not in the degree of like local governments having a lot of say. No, it's the power of the emperor, all right, who's claiming the mandate of heaven. All right, this is an idea of what's called divine right. This is as it applies to China. The example of divine right for Chinese emperors called the mandate of heaven. This is basically this idea that rulers, these emperors, claimed authority to rule from the gods, from the heavens where the gods reside. They give them supreme authority over all people within China. Therefore, they call themselves the Son of Heaven. So if you see that term, Son of Heaven, we are talking about the Chinese emperor specifically. All right, the Son of Heaven has claimed the mandate of heaven, and this is something that can be lost just as it can be gained. All right, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Reflecting the centralized government of China, there is a bureaucracy. So there are bureaucrats, and this begins with the Qin, and every subsequent dynasty throughout all of Chinese history will have bureaucracy. So the emperor has these officials, all of which are men who answer directly to the emperor and enforce their decisions. So again, strengthening this idea of centralized government. There's also this concept of a dynastic cycle. Chinese history is extremely predictable once we get to the Qin dynasty. All right, so once there's a dynasty, a family line of rulers, and that family, they pass on the title of Son of Heaven from father to son to son to son to keeping on, all right, until that family ends, that dynasty ends for whatever reason. There's this general understanding there's going to be a new dynasty to take its place. A new family is going to step in and claim the mandate of heaven and rule as this long line of sons of heaven. All right, so in this course, you will know all the key dynasties for China, starting with the Shang, which really we didn't cover at all with the beginnings, the River Valley civilizations, but know that the Shang is the first, the Zhou was the second, Zhou is spelled Zhou, or pronounced Zhou, but we're going to focus on the Qin and Han. So all the dynasties, they are in order, the Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, Sui, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing. All right, so when one dynasty ends, it seems inevitable that another one's going to rise. And we'll talk more about this dynastic cycle in a little bit. I'll give you some more explanation on that. All right. We're going to skip over the Shang and Zhou, honestly, because AP world no longer has any real focus on those. But do understand that before the Qin dynasty, for the Shang and Zhou dynasties, there was political decentralization. Rulers, kings, and emperors of China were really weak. They didn't have a lot of influence. And it tended to be that China was broken up into little states, small little kingdoms, all vying for control of China. And during a prolonged period of Chinese history called the Era of Warring States, there arose so much chaos, political, military chaos, that most people were extremely unhappy, unsatisfied, barely eked out a living, considering that the vast majority of the Chinese population has always been peasants, poor farmers. They barely survived, if they did at all, for long periods of time during this era of warring states. What they saw was that stability was gone from Chinese society. So during the period of approximately the 5th through 2nd centuries BCE. We see this era of warring states, and despite the chaos, this is actually a really pivotal moment in early Chinese history because it opened the door to the creation of many different philosophical systems that are going to be extremely important for Chinese history in the long run. We're going to look at three, but with primary emphasis on two. All right, three major schools of thought that developed. And they all have tried to answer the same question: how to create stability in society. So you got to keep in mind, before the Qin dynasty, all hell was breaking loose, lots of different little states, all fighting with one another for control. No one seems to be happy. No stability. So the three schools of thought that developed were as follows. Confucianism, developed by a man you probably better know as Confucius, but his Chinese name is Kung Fu Tzu, or Master Kong. His key work of philosophy is the Analects, although likely he didn't write it himself. His students or disciples likely did, but it expresses the core beliefs of the philosophy of Confucius, who tried to explain how to create a stable society. A contemporary, most likely a contemporary or someone who lived at the same time as Kung Fu Tzu or Confucius, was a man named Lao Tzu, who developed a philosophy we know as Taoism. By the way, you may see Taoism spelled with a D or a T. It's the same word, all right, Taoism. Lao Tzu is a character, all right, seriously. He really stands out here as this rather radical philosopher and what his ideas express. And like Confucius, the book that's associated with him, he probably didn't write it, called the Tao Te Ching, but it's a collection of supposed thoughts and philosophies of Lao Tzu that compose this bigger philosophy of Taoism. And last, a philosophy that I'll cover very briefly, but not spend a whole lot of time on, is a Chinese philosophy known as legalism. All right, legal as in laws, legal codes, developed by a man named Han Feizi. So what I'm going to do next is dig into Confucianism and Taoism, because those are really the most important ones to understand from the outset. You will probably get very tired of hearing about Confucianism or Taoism. I love learning about both of them and coming back to these over and over again in our course and our primary sources. But again, once you get these patterns down for Chinese history, you are golden for the most part for the next next 2,000 years almost for Chinese history. All right, so let's look at Confucius here. Confucius ruled, I'm sorry, not ruled, he never ruled actually. That leads me to go ahead and tell you his background. We really don't know a whole lot about Confucius. We do know that he tried to gain his local leaders' influence as an advisor, although his ruler did not really listen to him. Nobody really listened to him much, but after being so turned off by politics in terms of his local ruler not listening to him, he became a traveler and started teaching to anybody who would listen to him, and he gained a following of students. And he was constantly plagued by this idea of the lack of stability in society. His own father had died in one of these warring state conflicts whenever Confucius was really young, probably a baby. His mother, he was the product of a teenage pregnancy, and his mother died whenever he was really young. Nonetheless, we know him more so for this long-term influence of the Confucian philosophy associated with his name. And by the way, also, Confucius is the Latinized name. Again, his real Chinese name is Kung Fu Tzu, but you can call him Confucius. So anyhow, let's get to Confucius and how he tries to answer this question of how to create stability in society. Basically, he says it comes down to treating people properly, doing the right thing. All right. He believes in what we in the West might refer to as the golden rule, living by example. All right. Doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if you come from a Judeo-Christian background, you've likely heard of the golden rule. Even if you haven't, you've likely heard of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Lots of global cultures have that same concept. So even though it might be phrased slightly differently, it's there. Well, Confucius completely embraced this idea. We need to live by example. And when you set an example, you're like the wind blowing against the grass. All right. When you set an example, other people are going to bend to you. They're more likely to follow you and do as you do, and therefore that's going to create stability. Be humble. Don't be haughty. Don't be prideful. That's going to lead to instability, disharmony in society. So what all people need to strive for is to be a gentleman. All right? Get this. All right? You need to live with virtue. Treat others properly, do right by them, and they will do the same thing to you. It makes sense, doesn't it? All right. And when you do that, you create social harmony, the opposite of social chaos. You get social harmony. All right. So the people in the best position to lead by example are those people who are in positions of authority. All right. So create a moral example, all right, so that people below you in society are more likely to follow what they're supposed to do. All right. So again, act like the wind against the grass. Set that example. Others will follow your lead and bend to your will. Confucius taught the importance of education. All right. Education is a way that we can improve ourselves. And this winds up, by the time we get to the Han Dynasty, one of the classical era dynasties for China, they embraced this idea as a way to improve government. So men, this is going to be a very patriarchal philosophical system in China and East Asia as a whole. All right. Men who became educated in the Han Dynasty, who passed exams to get government jobs, they could prove their worthiness, their virtue, and gain government positions. And what that means is that you have a merit-based government, or a meritocracy, one in which you don't have people who are getting government jobs and government leadership positions just based on who they know and how much money you've got. You've got that position because you've proved your merit, your value. All right. More on that in just a little bit. Confucius, though, understood that stability for society came first and foremost from the family. All right. Family values. We hear that echoed here in the United States too. Family values. How we've gotten away from that we have social instability and chaos because families are broken. Children don't respect their parents. Parents don't do right by their children. Back and forth. All right. Well, Confucius says we've got to fix that. All right. He describes what are called the 5 relationships, and this includes family relationships as well. All right. I'm going to go through these 5 relationships really quickly. All right. These are the proper relationships, how you're supposed to behave between people in society as a whole. All right. Between ruler and subject, or emperor and citizen, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger siblings, elder friends and junior friends. Everyone has a position to play in society. You have an obligation to respect other people and do well by them. And if you follow and understand and respect those relationships and fulfill your proper role by them, everything else will fall in its place. All right. He said, Confucius believed, though, that within the family, perhaps the most important relationship was that between parents and their children, especially between father and son. And this is the idea of filial piety, the relationships between parents and their children, but especially between father and son. Filial piety, key concept idea. All right. So, according to Confucius, children within a family are to honor and obey, respect their parents, especially fathers, no matter what. No matter what. But as the father, as the parent, you have a duty to care and protect and raise up your children correctly. But even if you don't, as a parent, your children are supposed to obey you. And that's going to create stability within a family. Now, Confucius took this idea of filial piety within the family unit, and he said, let's extend that to all of China. So think about this. If we look at all of China, who would be the father figure for China? Now, if you're saying the emperor, you're right, the son of heaven. He has an obligation to rule, set good examples, take care of his children. Who are the children of China or the emperor? If you're thinking citizens, the subjects, the common people, you're right. But no matter what, those citizens of China, they have an obligation to the emperor, to the government, to be obedient, respectful, no matter what. Do what you're supposed to do. Don't question your position in society. Act according to your social position. So with this emphasis on father figures, it makes sense that this Confucian philosophy over time is going to become increasingly patriarchal, a focus on the male within society, within the focus on the father, the importance and power of the father within the family, the power of the bureaucrat, the power, most of all, of the son of heaven, the emperor. All right. So over time, we'll see increased female subservience or subjugation to men. And you may be aware of many different ways in which that appears in Chinese history. And we will be touching on those things throughout this course. So get into your minds here, Confucianism as a rather patriarchal philosophy or outlook on life. So I'm going to add a couple other things here that fit into this worldview. There is reverence for ancestors and rituals. All right, so even though your parents or grandparents might have died, you respect them no matter what. That creates a social cohesion and link to the past. Respect for your elders and your superiors, no matter what. Even though, again, they have a duty, their obligation to care for you and make sure that you're protected. Even if you don't, you obey. All right, you are obedient, you're respectful, you honor them. So respect the social hierarchies and respect traditions. If we do all those things according to Confucius, then we'll have stability. Follow the laws, follow the ways of the past. That will provide us a stable future. All right. So think about how you think of Confucianism. Are you a Confucianist? Do you agree with these things? Now, let's take a look at someone who strongly disagreed with Confucius. Living around the same time, you might read documents where these two guys met. They most likely never did, all right? But the antithesis to Confucius, oh, by the way, I'm sorry, I forgot I had this. Confucius, by the way, is unconcerned with religion. There's a quote by Confucius that how can we worry about the after death or the afterlife when we don't understand the here and now, all right? So Confucianism is more so a social philosophy or what's called a social religion than a spiritual religion. It's all about social relationships, all right? That's what's guiding society, all right? Not worrying about religion. You can worry about it. I mean, you can worship and honor your ancestors, all right, but that's not the end all. It's far more than that, and we need to be worried about the present, not what happens after we die. All right, so let's get to this next guy, the antithesis to Confucius, and that's Lao Tzu. All all right, living in the late 6th century BCE. There he is in his robe riding on the back of an ox. Lao Tzu, he completely disagreed with Confucius. Whereas Confucius is all about social relationships, following the rules, respecting and obeying authority, elders, Lao Tzu says, you're wasting your time on that, all right? What we need to do instead is focus on what is called Wu Wei, or effortless action. So by being inactive, we're actually being active. Let that sink in for a moment, all right? Taoism comes from the Chinese word Dao, which means the way. And here's a direct quote from Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. The way that cannot be named is not the way. All right, that's about it. The book, the Tao Te Ching, is rather mysterious in the way that it tries to explain what Taoism is. But when you try to sort through it all, what Lao Tzu tries to explain is how we can find harmony, stability in society by following the Tao. And what he gets to in the Tao Te Ching is that the Tao, is the way of nature, the natural order of things. Not trying to follow human-made laws, some sort of social hierarchy. Don't try to force things to happen. Just let them happen the natural way they're going to occur. Mother Nature doesn't worry about the seasons. They just happen, all right? When it's time to rain, it's going to rain. There's nothing we can do to force that, all right? So his argument is that we need to reject society, reject our ambitions. Don't worry about tomorrow. Let things happen the way that they're going to be. So therefore, what we need to do is live simply. Live in harmony with nature. Lao Tzu, if he knew what you were doing right now in listening to a lecture on classical Chinese, like, why the hell are you wasting your time on this? You need to be out taking a walk in the woods, go fishing, go sit on the lake, all right, in your boat, take a nap. The world will sort itself out, all right? So by just being, not doing, or practicing Wu Wei, by rejecting active attempts to change the natural course of things, we're just going to stress ourselves out. We're going to create chaos. It's not good for anybody, all right? If there was ever a Chinese hippie, it's Lao Tzu, all right? He's not worried about anything. He is so laid back. Go with the flow. Go with the flow of nature, all right? So he's not worrying about centralized government. He's not worrying about bureaucracy. He's not worrying about education systems, all right? He's instead trying to get in touch with nature, and that's how we need to be. So Taoism, in the long term, it's going to influence a lot of different cultural aspects of Chinese life. For example, medicine, Chinese medicine, trying to find a balance with nature by consuming natural remedies for things. Chinese teas as a medicine, that is heavily influenced by Taoist thought. Working with metals, metallurgy, that came about was trying to understand the principles of nature, at least in China. So what in the West are called alchemists. Here in China, metallurgists were oftentimes Taoists, looking for that balance or the yin-yang of nature, or with nature, between nature and humanity. Poetry and architecture, paintings, especially those of landscapes. There was a search for balance with nature again, and all these things. You can see here in this picture how this Chinese landscape of mountains and forest, the architecture itself tries to blend in with the surrounding landscape. It doesn't conflict with it. It's not glaring. It's not in your face. All right, that's a very Taoist approach to architecture. Landscape painting, if you see that in any works, where the people are really tiny, yet the landscape, natural world is so much bigger and engulfing them. I guarantee you it's Taoist in approach. All right. The last key philosophy of the era of warring states that I'm going to go very quickly on here is Han Feizi's legalism. So again, legalism, think laws, legal codes. All right. Unlike Confucius, who generally had an optimistic outlook on people, and Lao Tzu as well with Taoism, Han Feizi saw people as evil, just pure evil that had to be controlled. And who better to control people than one person in power, a dictator, an emperor with strict laws and punishments, set examples of people. And if you set examples of people who violate your laws and you do it harshly, whether by beheadings or any other nasty means of capital punishment or lightly beatings, capital or corporal punishment, then you set examples for the rest of society. Society needs to be controlled. And what better way to do that than through harsh examples? So this suggests the need for strong leadership and centralized government, tight control. He was not really concerned about education. Therefore, Han Feizi was strongly anti-Confucian, strongly anti-Taoist in approach. When we get to Qin Dynasty here in a moment, this is a philosophy that the Qin Dynasty fully embraced, and we'll see why that was. All right, so there's your three major philosophies of classical China: Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, but with heavy focus that you need to take on Confucianism and Taoism, those ideas. All right. So let's get here to our very first centralized dynasty for China, and that's the Qin Dynasty. Note the years, really brief, 221 BCE to 206 BCE. It is the shortest of all Chinese dynasties, mainly because there was only one emperor, and that was Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. Qin Shi Huangdi was a local noble from one of those warring states, from the state of Qin, and he was able to, through military maneuverings and alliances that he created, he was able to unify China really for the first time under single rule. And one way we see that is that China, the nation of China, is named for the Qin Dynasty. Probably didn't know that, but well, there you go. Qin Shi Huangdi is the first emperor, first true emperor of China, and he does that by military force. All right. Establishing a massive military, he unifies China, defeating one state after another, forcing all of these small Chinese states under his single rule, which therefore contributed to the creation of a strong centralized government. Qin Shi Huangdi is important beyond just unifying China, for setting lots of precedents or standards that future dynasties are going to follow. For example, creating a strong centralized government. All right. So after the fall of the Shang and the Zhou, we see the continuation of the dynastic cycle now under the Qin. And whenever the Qin ends, we'll see a new dynasty, the Han, rise. But following the Qin, again, we will see centralized governments throughout. And there's a number of reasons for this. For one, Qin Shi Huangdi established the very first bureaucracy for China, bureaucracy. So again, this is made up of bureaucrats or the scholar gentry. I'm sorry, take that back, not the scholar gentry, but bureaucrats who were specially chosen based upon their proven loyalty to Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. The bureaucrats carried out his orders throughout all of China, so therefore his power is centralized. He gives decrees, he gives orders, the bureaucrats implement them throughout China. To create a strong military that would maintain unity for China, he implemented a military draft or conscription that brought in common Chinese men into the military to serve him. He made extensive use of coerced labor in the form of corvée. This is a key term to know, corvée labor, where peasants, mostly men, were required for several months out of the year to complete government work, whether it's building roads, building defensive walls. palaces for him. Um, this was obligated upon all peasant men if they were able, required to here by law. And it's one thing that led to his downfall was this implementation of corvée labor. Another means by which centralized government was strengthened and created under Qin Shi Huangdi was the application of legalist rule, this legalism philosophy. So he was notorious for his harsh punishments of anyone who stood in his way, who violated his laws. And so that set examples for the rest of the Chinese population, and also was likely a reason for his downfall. And because of that, he was anti-Confucian. He, in fact, tried to eliminate Confucianism because Confucianism taught how rulers should set examples, quality examples, live by virtue. And this guy certainly wasn't virtuous or kind to the people, as shown by the military draft and his legalist policies. So he actually had Confucian teachers executed, burned alive, beheaded. This was not a good time to be a teacher in China. All right, but lots of projects were carried out to strengthen his rule, centralized rule. For example, creating palaces for demonstrating his wealth and power, including his capital in his capital of Xi'an in central China. Creating a road system, which is a means by which not just trade could happen, but also movement of soldiers and supplies, and his bureaucrats throughout all of China, since it's now unified. So it's a unifying feature. Always think of that with road systems. He also developed what becomes known as the Great Wall of China. It starts with the Qin dynasty, but it becomes an ongoing project for all dynasties with the exception of one that we'll get to in a couple of weeks. This is primarily because of a constant fear of outsiders from the north. Remember again this concept of xenophobia, this idea that foreigners are to be feared and are no good for China. But on the northern border of China, there is this constant threat of nomadic peoples, pastoralist peoples, horseback riders, namely the Huns, or in the Chinese name, the Xiongnu, who, if we don't build this wall, they're going to take us over. They're going to invade. Well, guess what? This Great Wall is built using corvée labor, all right, conscripted workers, peasants, by the millions. They build this wall, and the Xiongnu still invade, all right? Maybe there's a lesson there for all of us about walls. But nonetheless, the Great Wall begins construction. It's never completed. There's lots of holes in this wall. And those pastoralists are also horseback riders. It's pretty easy for them to travel around the wall. But nonetheless, it also serves as a representation, a physical representation of where China, the Middle Kingdom, is, and the barbarian world beyond it. All right. Qin Shi Huangdi is also known for the construction of the Tomb of the Terracotta Warriors, which was uncovered, rediscovered in the early 1970s by Chinese farmers working to build a well in one of their fields. And what they came up with were these, started finding were these soldiers made out of clay or terracotta that had been built for Qin Shi Huangdi's afterlife. Basically an army for him in the next world, whatever that might be, so he could continue his despotic, tyrannical rule. I'll show you a couple pictures of these things just so you know. And here's a good visual again for centralization, decentralization, the difference. So again, starting with the Qin and followed by the Han Dynasty and all subsequent dynasties for China, we have strong, tight rule. So imagine the Son of Heaven here in the middle, and then the bureaucrats carrying out orders throughout. Unlike throughout China, unlike a decentralized government where, yeah, they might have one ruler, but power is divided up. Maybe regionally, locally. So centralization, think tight, powerful rule by the government, whereas decentralization, weak central governments, where there's more power spread out amongst different levels of government. All right, so have that view anytime we talk about centralization in this course. Here's the Qin dynasty as it appeared in the classical period. Notice here everything in the dark areas, that is what was controlled politically by Qin Shi Huangdi. It's a lot smaller than modern day China, but note Xianyang or Xi'an in central China, and all these roads leading outward like a pinwheel, leading out in all these directions, and that is a further unifying feature for trade, for a common culture, rules, measurements, legal codes, bureaucrats to enforce the orders of Qin Shi Huangdi. This is the Great Wall, although I will admit that this is how the stereotypical view of the Great Wall is. The Great Wall, as it appeared in the Qin dynasty, was not very tall. This is a lot more impressive. This is a portion that was built in the Ming Dynasty. But usually this is what you think of when you hear of the Great Wall of China. So imagine here, it's a symbolic division between the Middle Kingdom and the barbarian world. So to the south of the Great Wall, here is the Middle Kingdom, the civilized world, and to the north, the uncivilized world, the barbarian world, the land of the pastoralists, if we're talking about northern China, where this Great Wall is. So again, millions of peasants were forced to go off and work to construct the Great Wall, and because they were forced to do this backbreaking work that took themselves away from their farms, this created a great deal of animosity towards Qin Shi Huangdi, to the point that whenever he died, all right, there were mass rebellions against his successor, his son, to the point that he never really truly took power, and the dynasty ended with Qin Shi Huangdi. I forgot. Here's me whenever I was hanging out on the Great Wall a couple years ago. It's really cool. If you've never been to the Great Wall of China, I highly recommend you get a chance to go. You go. You would never think that walking on a wall would be an amazing experience, but it absolutely was. So cool to be there and experience that. So maybe you've been and experienced that too, so now you have some context for what you were experiencing while you were there. Anyways, here's the Tomb of the Terracotta Warriors. This is just a portion of what has been uncovered, but every one of these are soldiers, and every one of them are different. All right, they are unique. Originally, they were holding real weapons made of wood for the purpose of Qin Shi Huangdi carrying on his rule in his afterlife. So this is a good reflection of the ego that this guy had to have had in order to establish such a complex structure for his death. So not very well liked at the time, but he does set major precedents for future Chinese dynasties, including the Han. So let's get here to our last things with the Chinese classical era. And what I want to touch on here next is the Chinese dynastic cycle. And if you get this into your heads, then you are good for so much of Chinese history. Chinese history is predictable if you know this cycle. So unlike in the West, where we are here, like in the United States, we usually think of history marching forward, like a progression forward in time. There's no looking back. Well, in Chinese culture and their view on history, they see history happening in cycles, that it repeats itself. And this is really clear with this dynastic cycle. So whenever one dynasty ends, one family's rule ends, another one's going to appear. And again, this was the case from the Shang dynasty back in the eras of the early foundational period all the way up to the year 1912 that we had this dynastic cycle in place, the 1912 CE. All right, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. You may need to replay it to catch everything, but here's the predictable pattern that we see throughout Chinese history up till about 1912. All right, so a new dynasty is going to gain power. So that means that a family proves that they have claimed the mandate of heaven, all right, that they are going to be the sons of heaven by creating peace and order. They might do things like conquering their enemies, conquering the previous dynasty because that previous dynasty had been mistreating the people, and a new dynasty is proclaimed. A new family is going to establish this line of rule for a period of time. Usually it's for a couple centuries, but again, you might see something as short as like the Qin dynasty that was only about 15 years long. With this new dynasty being established, there's usually a period of prosperity, all right, usually long-term, where peace is established, borders are protected, especially against those northern nomads, those pastoralist people, with the help of the militaries, the armies, the cavalry, and the Great Wall. Taxes are lowered. Trade is booming. The people are happy. Even the peasants are generally doing well, all right? But it's only a matter of time before that prosperity starts to decline, all right? Problems start to arise. There is going to be a point where government officials, bureaucrats especially, become corrupt. They use their positions of power to advance their own interests, maybe collecting taxes for themselves rather than going to the central government and therefore the rest of the people to benefit them. And inevitably, more taxes need to be raised because there are greater expenses due to that corruption or other concerns, maybe new military threats. This is oftentimes going to be exploited by those northern nomads, those barbarians. They understand that there's internal problems in China, that dynasty is now weak. Well, we have a chance to attack them and invade, go raiding through China. All right. So over time, the power of that dynasty, that ruler that claims, or rulers that claim to be the son of heaven, that declines. And the old dynasty is going to be challenged. They are seen as having lost that mandate of heaven. They're not taking care of the people. They've raised taxes. There might be plagues, natural disasters that are assigned from the heavens that these rulers, this family, no longer has the authority, the divine right or mandate of heaven to rule. And inevitably, rebellions are going to occur from the inside out. Sometimes by nobles or generals, sometimes by the peasants themselves. Again, they're going to always make up about 95% of the population. It may even be that those barbarians officially break through the northern borders of China, go on massive raids, sometimes even take over, all right, in a couple of cases. But once that family, that old dynasty is seen as having lost the mandate of heaven, if we follow the dynastic cycle, well, it seems inevitable that there's going to be a new family that's going to step in place and a new dynasty is going to be proclaimed. And that cycle repeats over and over and over again. So we have, throughout our course, we'll look here at the Shang, Zhou, Qin, and Han, Sui, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties. Again, this lasts up till 1912 CE. All right. Let's go on. So whenever the Qin dynasty falls, if there's this idea of the dynastic cycle, this idea of the mandate of heaven, well, it's inevitable. There's going to be another family that steps in. And in this case, it's the Han family. All right, they're going to establish the Han dynasty. And this is the high point, the golden age of classical China, 206 BCE, before the Common Era, to 220 CE. So to give you some context for what's happening in other parts of Afro-Eurasia at this time, the Han dynasty is existing at the high point, same time as the high point of the Roman Empire over in the Mediterranean. All right, they're contemporaries of one another, and there were indirect contacts between the Roman Empire and Han dynasty, despite the fact that they were on the far extremes of Eurasia. All right. India, when we get to that here soon, they're also contemporaries to the Gupta dynasty, which you probably don't know of yet, but we soon will. All right, so I'm going to go through the Han dynasty much faster than I did with the Qin. And like the Qin, they set further precedents for future Chinese dynasties. For one, they understood that one of the good things about the Qin dynasty, despite how brutal Qin Shi Huangdi was to the people, using conscription in terms of building things like the Great Wall and raising taxes to fund all of this stuff, all right, and using their militaries to suppress rebellions. The Han dynasty understood the importance of political centralization. All right. Um, what they tried to do was weaken landed aristocrats. So whenever we talk about landed aristocrats, we're talking about nobles, people of noble ancestry who own land. All right. They tended to be the ones who would become the new founders of a new dynasty in that dynastic cycle. So we need to limit their power. So what better way to do that than to create a bureaucracy that isn't based on necessarily noble blood and loyalty, purely loyalty. And that's going to be established by an emperor named Emperor Wu Di, 140 to 87 BCE, really early here in the Han Dynasty. All right. He again understood the importance of creating a strong centralized government to have unified control over China. So by creating a bureaucracy, we can do that. Have bureaucrats answer or carry out the orders of the emperor. So what Emperor Wu Di does is he decides that we're going to use Confucianism as a guide for our government. Han Dynasty fully embraces Confucianism. Now, legalism technically still around, all right, but we're going to use this as a guide. And in order to become a bureaucrat, a government official who works directly for the emperor, in order to get your job, you're going to have to pass an exam, all right? What's called a civil service exam or Confucian civil service exam. What it does is it tests your knowledge of Confucianism, Confucian philosophy. And this is no easy exam, extremely difficult. And guess what? This is the origin of standardized testing. All those standardized tests that you've ever taken in school and all the standardized exams that you will take in the future, including the May exam for this course. It has this as its roots, civil service exam. So if you want to prove your value and your skill, your merit for working for the government, you've got to pass this Confucian civil service exam. Show that you understand and fully embrace Confucian values, and you get the job, all right? But again, this is really rare for you to pass, for people to take this exam. We'll talk more about that next week. But for those men who took the civil service exams and passed it, became bureaucrats, they become known as the scholar gentry. Scholars because they have a strong academic background in Confucianism. Gentry because they're the elites. They're upper class, not necessarily because they're of noble ancestry, of which many were, but because they passed this exam. All right, and they are hobnobbing with the emperor himself, carrying out his orders. It's a point of pride. So this creates a stable, merit-based government for China that we'll see repeated over and over again. There's only going to be one dynasty after the Han Dynasty that does not have civil service exams, and they're like the outlier, all right? So all future dynasties, with the exception of one, are going to use Emperor Wu Di's system of Confucian civil service exams for choosing bureaucrats. So high-quality government leaders. It's what we want. It creates stability. All right. Because of this political centralization, the stable government that the people were generally happy with in the Han Dynasty, it allowed for further imperial expansion. All right. A period of peace within China and along its borders. Korea and Vietnam come under heavy influence of China, and that's a topic we'll come back to later on. So again, this is pro-Confucian, this Han Dynasty, unlike the previous Qin Dynasty. And we see the development of a new social hierarchy called the Confucian social hierarchy. More on that later on. All right. And with this prosperity in the Han Dynasty, this nearly 400 years of prosperity in China, we see population growing rapidly. 10% of the population urbanized, and that's a high rate, the most urbanized population of all places worldwide in this classical era. In large part because of increased agricultural productivity. A lot more food is going to be produced, and always remember, when more food is produced, a greater agricultural surplus, population is able to stabilize and increase, so population growth. And early on, first 2 centuries or so, the Han Dynasty had relatively low taxes, so peasants were happy. They owned their own land. They didn't have to worry about invasions. They didn't have to worry about starvation, in part because of public granaries, basically silos, storage areas for grain, surplus, in case there were bad times. Here's something that happens. Around 200 BCE, in China, we see something that doesn't really make a lot of sense considering what we know about their outlook on the outside world. And what was that outlook? Exactly, xenophobia. They're fearful questioning of outside ideas. But here around 200 BC, a foreign religion comes into China called Buddhism. It's introduced from India via the Silk Road. And it becomes widespread by the time we get to the end of the Han Dynasty. So even though they're xenophobic, there's usually some exceptions to this, and Buddhism is a good example. And I believe this is in part because it doesn't clash with other philosophies, other beliefs. It allows for and adapts to ancestor worship and animism and polytheism and Confucianism and Taoism. All right. So in the long term, Han Dynasty is a much more stable, prosperous period for China than the Qin was, but both set precedents for future dynasties. Here we see a map of the Qin dynasty, the Han Dynasty as it appeared at its high point around about, or in the 1st century CE, with more road networks linking further China. Here's Korea coming under some Han influence, and Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and further connections to areas beyond China that are even stronger. And what we see here is the Silk Route leading across Central Asia. And you can see the arrow pointing on towards the Middle East. All right, so don't ever think that China is completely isolated. There are certainly connections, not just with the Silk Road, but what other interregional trade network? That's right, the Indian Ocean Trade Network. All right, and here we can see this a little bit better. Here's China and East Asia with direct connections to the Silk Roads leading to Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, and onwards to its terminal point in the Mediterranean. And then also connections with the Indian Ocean Trade Network by going around Southeast Asia. All right, so again, 2 key interregional trade networks linking classical China with other areas of Afro-Eurasia. The Silk Routes and the Indian Ocean Trade Network are also known as the Indian Ocean Sea Lanes. So with that, we are going to examine a little bit more in detail philosophical systems, the social hierarchy on another day. But that is the big overview, and I know that was a lot. But if you get these concepts down, then you, again, are going to be set for future discussion of China as we progress through our course.